So I want to welcome everyone for joining us this session. Actually, the third session of Transcending Beyond Borders, where the working groups of interoperability, governance, and standards of INATBA we are getting together to discuss several topics related with this governance of blockchain. So the session of today is actually dedicated to language, the language of blockchain. And in general, we see that language can unite us, can unite people, but also it can create conflicts because conflicts arise most of the times from misunderstanding. So also if we see in our personal life, sometimes the misuse of one word can cause several issues and problems. So if we want to build a resilient governance system, global governance system for blockchain, obviously one specific point is language. So in this specific regard, we have seen that in the last months and years, we have several efforts from standardization communities, but also for national legislators trying to establish some common meaning for words. So just to give you an example, just in the recent MiCA, there's this debate about what actually means the definition of crypto asset. So one misunderstanding or one application of one definition, now it can have different effects. And I think that for having this efficient governance of blockchain, to actually learn how this process is turning out in the part of blockchain will help us to understand also the blockchain and the interoperability issues that are coming next to that. So without going further, I will just want to make two brief announcements. Well, the first one actually is I want to thank everyone from the working groups, but especially Adcrop, that I don't see if he's connected. Yeah, I think he's connected. I want to thank him for actually supporting all these organization in this event, and obviously to Martina Piazza, that she has been extremely active putting together all the panelists. So I really want to express my thanks to them. And a second announcement is that this session is going to be recorded. So just you will know. And all the speakers have already give their consent to this process of being recorded, and this recorder will allow us to actually reflect further about the debate that we'll have today. So to start, I probably I will give the floor to Monique Bachner. She is the one of the co-chairs of the INAVBA working group, but in general, she has a broad experience on the financial law and financial sector, directing several boards and running legal governance advice services. And without further ado, I will just give the floor to Monique, that she will give some introductory remarks. Monique, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Gustav. Yes, so welcome everybody. So this is the third in the series of events that have been organized jointly between INATBA's interoperability standards and governance working groups. When we started organizing these series of events, we were thinking a little bit about, the issues on a global scale to scaling blockchains. So the first event that we did in late June focused on transacting beyond borders and building that infrastructure, but we focused very much on the policy making aspect of the blockchain, the blockages to growing blockchain on a global scale. We had various country and regional representatives presenting roadmaps and different ideas of strategies on how they would make sure that blockchains in their region or country would be interoperable across borders. We followed that up with an event on 15th of July, which we called Transcending Borders, Enabling and Supporting Large-Scale DLT Infrastructure, where we focused predominantly on interoperability and interoperability issues between those large-scale infrastructure projects. And then building on that, we have now today the event which is focusing on language. I'm an Australian. I grew up in Australia, monolingual country. You'd think, language is quite easy. I moved to Europe, and particularly to Luxembourg. Suddenly I found myself in an environment where the school system is in 3 languages. Every single child does different subjects depending on what they're learning in a different language. Official documents might be issued in up to 5 languages. Constantly translating in different and using different languages in different environments, whether that's the supermarket, at work, at home, and social settings. And what one becomes very keenly aware of is that, first of all, if you can't speak all of those languages fluently, you're actually excluded from some of the discussions. But even if you do, there's so many nuances in translation or words which don't really have the same meaning or even exist in one of the other languages, that often you have some of these subtle challenges to understanding each other when you're just trying to grasp the true meaning of something. There's a professor at INSEAD called Erin Meyer, and she has a book called The Culture Map. And one of the things that she sets out in there is that often when people are very different, somebody from Europe is sitting next to somebody from China, because of the visual differences between people, that often you're more alert to the differences and the nuances in the language and taking more care to make sure you've understood each other. But once we get remote, like we are often in the blockchain world, or even we think we are speaking the same language because we think we're part of the same tribe or the same ecosystem or the same working groups, we often then don't step back and make sure that we really are understanding the same thing. And that can lead to significant misunderstandings. And if we're building global infrastructure, that can then be a really major issue down the line. So welcome to everybody. And I hope you will enjoy this different view on, interoperability and scaling challenges for blockchain. And on that note, I'll hand back to Gustavo and to Mariana to lead the sessions.
Thanks a lot, Monique. So I think we will start. Yeah, Mariana, I don't know if you also want to say some more.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great.
So, first speaker, hope is well connected with us, Geoffrey Godwell. Okay, Senior Research Associate in the Financial Computing and Analytics Group at UCL, London, University College of London. Serves as convener of two ISO working group on blockchain and DLTs, with a previous financial background in portfolio management at Goldman Sachs, and recently working with the central bank digital currencies together with central banks on some privacy and security issues. So what we would like to ask you, Geoffrey, is about the concrete challenges faced in the elaboration of semantics and technological standards.
Right. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Martina. I appreciate it. So I think some of the other speakers on this panel are going to discuss languages in the context of inclusion and languages in the context of semantic relationships, which are very important topics. What I'm going to talk about very briefly is the challenges associated with translations themselves and creating standards that entail translations as ISO standards and other international standards do. So my experience comes from work in blockchain and DLT, and in particular, my work in vocabularies in this space. And I'm going to bring in some examples from that in this context, given that those examples are publicly available and available to INATBA to read, and indeed available to everyone to read. So the first issue that comes to so there are three main issues that come to mind when we think about translations and from the perspective of conveners and project group leaders working on vocabularies and terms. And the first is actually, I think, a very basic one. It's the cost associated with doing translations and the implications that might vary across ISO members or across members of different countries or different language groups within the international community. Now, it turns out that some translations are going to be much harder to make than others. For example, it might be the case that translating between English and French or English and Spanish and back might be relatively easy, whereas translating between English and Russian or between English and Japanese, for example, might be a bit harder. And there are many examples of this. And what's really important about these kinds of differences in cost of doing the translation is that it has implications for the progression of these standards and the decisions, indeed, by consensus that we might have to make concerning revisions or changes to those standards. For example, should we have core agenda? Should we have amendments? Should we make revisions? How often should we do these things? All of these questions are ultimately tempered by the reality that some members of our community will bear greater costs than others of performing that actual translation. The second major challenge that we see are differences in specifically what it is that we're defining. So, for example, some languages may prefer, by the nature of the language, for us to define nouns versus verbs versus adjectives. And one example that you can see if you look at the 22739 document is the question of a term such as validate. Should we define the term validate? Should we define the term validated? Should we define the term validation? So we have a verb and an adjective and a noun, and we have a choice, potentially, about which one is best to define. Now, it turns out that some languages will prefer, by the nature of the language, for us to define a noun or a verb or an adjective based upon what can be derived from what. For example, in English, it might be the case that it's relatively easy to generate a noun based upon a verb, but in other languages, that benefit might be smaller, or that benefit might be outweighed by the costs associated with the particulars of what we would need to define if we're defining a verb. And so what we need to consider as the authors of a document in which we define terms is really not just how verbs and nouns and adjectives are defined and used in our language, but how they're used in other languages as well. And this is really significant because sometimes the translations will have a character shift, basically, after we choose to define the wrong term. So, for example, if we define a verb and it needs to be a noun in a different language, or it would be better if it were a noun in a different language, then we would probably find ourselves in a situation in which the definition of that noun might not actually deliver the same semantic meaning as what we expect the noun to have been if we had generated it from the verb in English, and so on. The third issue is really about the specific. It's really about some of the semantic meanings associated by the subtle semantic choices that we're making when we define a term. There are ambiguities that vary from one language to another, and areas in which a term might be considered ambiguous, but for which that ambiguity seems to have no problem in the language that we're defining. For example, in ISO, there is a model for the definition of terms wherein we're expecting the definition to substitute for the term. It could drop into a sentence in which the term is used, and the sentence will still make sense. Now, if you look in the 22739 work, you can see the definition of the term consensus mechanism. And the term has, it reads as rules and procedures by which consensus is reached. Now, now this seems perfectly innocuous. However, when it comes to translating this, we might run into some unexpected snags. For example, does this mean any rule or procedure by which consensus is reached? Or does this specifically mean the set consisting of all of the rules and procedures by which consensus is reached? In some languages, we will be forced to make this choice. And the choice that we make might not be the choice that is made by the people who had decided upon that English translation, that English definition, and so on. And it is interesting to see how in literature, translations tend to have a shorter shelf life than the original work. And And I think we can see how some of this might be part of the reason why. These translations are forced into choices that might not necessarily match the author's original intent and might lead to inconsistencies or other problems down the road. So from our perspective, building an international standard is more complex than just the question of defining terms that make sense in our own language. We must be sensitive to these other languages and issues as well. And that's all. Thank you so much, Martina.
Thanks, Geoffrey. So maybe just quick question before giving the floor to Gustavo, that's going to present the second speaker. What about the term blockchain application? I am still struggling with it because for me, there's quite a misunderstanding. So sometimes it's better to say blockchain-based application. So we are referring to a project, a business project that can be translated into a blockchain project. And then if we just say blockchain application, we can also mean an app that is constructed on top of the blockchain network. So are you also arguing on that at ISO, or? Hello?
I'm sorry, is this question for me?
Yeah, for you.
Can you repeat, please?
So what about the term blockchain application? That can have two different meanings. So one can be just, so a business model, a project that has been translated into a blockchain project, or an application that is built on top of the blockchain. So it can be just a particular API or a tool that is constructed on top. Is it a term that you are elaborating on in ISO or not?
Well, you'll notice that if you look at the online, if you look at ISO 22739 definitions that are online, you'll see that we do not define that term. And indeed, terms that are ambiguous like this are potentially problematic exactly for the reasons that you described. Now, I would suggest that terms that are ambiguous are basically terms that we would like to avoid. Now, I can't speak specifically about this hypothetical example, but ambiguous terms are problematic, and we endeavor to not use terms that would be ambiguous. The terms that, now, clearly we have a choice in creating a terminology. We can specifically say we're going to define it one way rather than the other, although doing that runs the risk of not reaching consensus, because ultimately there might be some parties who take the view that we should refer to one of those choices that you mentioned rather than the other, or vice versa. So really, I think that clarity is extremely important, especially in the context of translation. And part of the problem with these translations is that people are expecting, people have different expectations, not only based upon the language that they're using, but also based upon the context in which they're using it. And you can see that there are some terms, like, for example, fork, where we recognize that there are some differences, right? There is a context of fork in which we're referring to software systems versus a context of fork in which we're referring to blockchains, specifically the structure of blockchains or distributed ledgers. And it's really sometimes hard to be clear when the terms of art that are used in the industry are inconsistent. And I think that this is actually an area where we have a rather tough task ahead of us in choosing which particular terms make sense given some reality of inconsistent usage on the ground. And in as much as all of these standards are really intending to not only guide, but also reflect the state of the art, we need to be careful about the decisions that we make in this space. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. So actually, it touches a bit the fact that English is sometimes it's not so I would say explicit language. So of course, when you put together blockchain and application, we do not understand if it's an application of the blockchain or an application that is on top of the blockchain. But thanks to it's actually a really ambiguous term. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to comment on that, you can scroll down and you can see the definition for decentralized application that might help.
Okay.
And you can certainly see how we try to square the circle around these kinds of questions. Although again, it's much better to be clear than to admit for that kind of ambiguity when it is so central.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Gustavo, it's back to you.
Yeah, thanks also, Geoffrey, for your presentation. It's very interesting to this walkthrough to the different choices that sometimes, like you have mentioned, includes not to translate or not to define. I'm sorry, not to define one specific term. Moving with our discussion, our next speaker is Kirsten Pomales Langenbrunner. I hope I pronounced well your last name, Kirsten. She actually has a great experience on the psychological standards. Currently, she's the vice chair of the IEEE P2145, so she also will bring this experience of this other standardization community. But most especially, she's the managing director of Coalitions Consulting. That is a consultancy that helps blockchain systems to develop the human components of a blockchain, which include governance, community trust, and stakeholder commitment. So I like also that your vision or your approach to blockchain is actually from the human side. That is what actually lies beneath the chain, right? So we want to welcome you, and we want to also hear your experience in this context. Kirsten, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much once again, Gustavo and Mariana, for welcoming me. Thank you all to the audience for coming out. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation for you today. So my talk today is called Openness as a Solution to Language Barriers in DLT Governance Standardization. So IEEE P2145 is a working group that's working on specifically standards in blockchain governance. So very, very niche subsection of blockchain world as a whole. And we have a sub-working group that's working on language standards for blockchain governance, which I chair, as well as being the vice chair to the at-large group. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about our methodology today and why we've gone about eventually choosing to pursue open standards as opposed to some of the more traditional ways of going about standards creation. So during today's discussion, I'm going to talk about a couple things. So first, I'll start off with the importance of lexical standards in governance, why we're even pursuing this. Then talk a little bit about language barriers to DLT governance standardization. And then we're going to be talking about IEEE P2145's methodology pursuing open standards as a solution to some of these barriers. So Gustavo, you gave a great introduction to me, not too much else to say. Managing Director at Coalitions Consulting and Vice Chair at IEEE P2145. Once again, pleasure being here with you today. So to get things started, let's talk about the importance of lexical standards for blockchain governance. So why do we even need blockchain governance? Well, for those of you that aren't super familiar with this niche, blockchains are collectives. And they don't have decision-making that's as straightforward as a lot of other technologies because they take collective governance. They take everyone coming together and making shared decisions about how to maintain the system. This is why we need governance for blockchains. But the governance needs of individual blockchains are incredibly diverse. You have private blockchains, you have public blockchains, you have a bunch of different flavors of each of these. And all of them have slightly different governance systems. And there's no one right way to do governance. There are just different ways to do governance. So how do we standardize governance? How do we analyze governance? Well, more than dictating what the best type of governance is, we need to be able to talk about governance. We need to be able to observe, identify patterns, and communicate about distributed ledger governance systems. And in order to do that, we need a shared language. So as we learned during the introduction, there are a lot of barriers to communicating about a lot of these components of blockchain systems, specifically governance. Governance is something that's inherently multi-stakeholder. You have people communicating, sharing ideas, and both within blockchain systems as well as amongst different blockchain systems, there can be very disparate language used. So we at P2145 believe that producing a shared way of describing governance is very integral to support all of these things, advancing understanding of diverse governance systems, identifying emerging best practices, which is super important for the industry, comparison of governance patterns, innovation and improvement on existing patterns, and of course, interoperability between governance systems. So we all know we need to be able to communicate about DLT governance, but easier said than done. There's my pun for the day. So language barriers to governance standardization. We heard a little bit about some of these earlier, but I'll just briefly run through them again. First of all, people speak different languages. We have hundreds of thousands of different languages all over the world. You have governance, writing, regulation relating to blockchain in different language. You have people producing research in different languages. You have different communities building entire ecosystems where most of the people in the community speak a certain set of languages or one language, and that can cause some problems. Even when we don't have language as in, what type of language you're speaking as a barrier within an ecosystem, oftentimes we still have different groups using the same term in different manners, or we have different groups using different words to represent the same concept. These two things are super, super common right now, considering how early we are in this industry. There are lots of different concepts that have arisen that are used in different manners like this. And one of the natural reasons that this happens is terminology trends are developed in silos. This is just what humans do. We each have our cultural silos that we're in. Maybe we're in a specific chain ecosystem. Maybe our geographic region has specific terminology that all of us use. Even inside of individual companies, you have terminology that becomes so ingrained in us that we assume oftentimes that everyone else understands what we're talking about when it's not always as clear as it should be. So what's the problem with all these barriers? Well, they make productive information sharing and research very difficult. This is the transactional model of communication. It's a model that I really love. I'll explain it just a little bit here. So each of us, when we speak, we're encoding the thoughts that are in our mind into a message, and we're sending it over to someone else. They then have to decode it and interpret the meaning, and then they can respond. And oftentimes all of the barriers that I just talked about cause errors, so to say, in that loop, which makes it very difficult to be productive in our collaborations. So we know that we need a lexical standard, but how do we get past all of these barriers? So while there are no solutions per se for many of these barriers, like Jeff said, there are a lot of problems that we have to just come across when we're developing language standards in technology and beyond. But at IEEE P2145, we are pursuing open standards as one way to mitigate a lot of these problems. So just a brief hit on standards in general. Standards development also happens in silos. It's something that we can't do away with. It's natural. But the more barriers to entry in a silo, the more difficult it is to have your population inside representative of all of the diversity out there in language and culture, and even just in different chain ecosystems, bringing people together to produce a standard. You have some standard groups that are very heavily Ethereum community centric or Hyperledger community centric, and all of that can cause biases in the outputs that these standards organizations are creating. So we're not really getting rid of the silos per se. This illustration is a hyperbole. Rather, we're just trying to thin the lines between our silo and the outside world through a couple of measures. So we have open membership, which means anyone out there who believes that they have something to contribute to our lexical standards for governance effort can join. They can sit in on our meetings. They can either listen, contribute. We also allow individual membership, which means you don't have to be sponsored by a company in order to join our standards body, which is how some other standards bodies operate. We also have open workflows. So this means we try to, best we can, share regularly with just the global audience updates on our work. So we don't have to necessarily wait until the very end product to start bringing in external feedback on our work. This also helps us overcome some of the biases inherent in any silo. Also, we have open source standards. So obviously open workflows, open source standards, we're going to be putting these out for anyone to use free of charge and anyone to, more importantly, alter free of charge. So if they have improvements, we're completely open to accepting improvements beyond just traditional peer review. And then also we're pursuing collaboration and knowledge sharing between other standards bodies. This is something that everyone's really working hard to do. And we're not the best at it yet. It can be very difficult, but we're hoping that, through sharing our work in forums like this with INATBA and ISO and others, we can really bridge that gap a bit better. So a little bit about how this open standards activity has impacted the makeup of our group. So as you can see, we still have some trends more heavily in one direction than the other. We have about 70% of our makeup from the Americas, and we don't currently have any representation in Oceania, unfortunately. So if there are any Australians or New Zealanders out there that want to join, please hit us up. This was conducted a few days ago in our most recent meeting. We have a bunch of different languages representative in our group. Even though we're composing our definitions, composing and aggregating standards in English, we are really trying to make sure that we're being super duper explicit with all of our language so that it can be easily translated. And another benefit of our open source product is it can be taken and translated into any number of languages without too much oversight from us. If people want to do it, they can go and run, and hopefully that proliferation of translation and review will help mitigate some of the problems that Jeff outlined. So, like I said, we're not really proposing that this solves all of the problems, all of these barriers to lexical standard development, but we do believe that it makes it easier to understand and address the constraints that we have as people trying to develop language standards. So that's the end of my presentation. If you want to get in contact with us, you could follow IEEE P2145 on LinkedIn. We have a website that's also shown here, and we have our at-large meetings every third Friday monthly. So if you want to tune into that or contribute, first step would be reaching out to me. I'm going to send out this slideshow afterwards as well, so you could click on these links. But if you want to reach out, here you go. Thank you so much, Gustavo. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for your presentation. Just one question on this notion of open standards and actually the role of individuals. So how actually the group actually filter individuals and affiliations? Because obviously, I don't know if there is like a joint affiliation that companies can actually be also as companies, or every individual has to like declare affiliations, just to understand how information and transparency works. Because I see that that's one of the barriers of open standards, is actually to understand where everybody's coming from, to also avoid potential conflict of interest. So I don't know if you can tell us how this actually works on practice.
Yeah. So in our standards organization, we do ask everyone to explicitly give us their affiliation so that we, can mitigate any conflicts of interest. However, we don't allow like corporate individuals to enter. So we don't allow like a corporation to be an individual member of our group. Rather, representatives of that corporation will come in and be individual members listing their affiliation. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any one company where we have a massive amount of representation. It's not like IBM has 50 people in our group and then everyone else is just, working for a company or a university. We generally have a pretty diverse group. We have entrepreneurs, we have professors, we have, people working for these larger companies, representatives of government. So the open standard and having that, affiliation listed so that we avoid any conflicts, but still have it be open has been, in my opinion, pretty productive for us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you for your presentation. So I give the floor to Mariana, that she will introduce our next speaker.
Pleasure. Okay. Third speaker, sorry, Italian as me, Pietro Marchionni. Nice to meet you. We would like to ask you to elaborate on how you will handle conflicts and inconsistency between languages that different UE-based and not European-based. Please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pietro Marchionni. I'm the convener of the European Blockchain Service Infrastructure. So the infrastructure that Europe is building up to host, let's say, cross-border services provided within the Union and hopefully also outside the Union. And as the question that kindly has been made, first of all, we are implicitly somehow a standardization body. It means that the experience that Europe is running within the blockchain ecosystem, so to have a multinational permission ledger that represent characteristics that are unique in the world, is somehow a unique experience, as I said, and also somehow facts make standards. So we are running these services for the 28 member states, and there are others that wants to join, and they are asking to join the EBSI even outside Europe, and this is a process that we're looking at. And language barrier is somehow a daily, I won't say issue, a daily characteristic of our work. So the idea from our point of view, and we are running also governance models to handle that, is the language barrier goes at two levels, I would say. One level is somehow technical level, where you have data that can be expressed in different languages. Let's consider a typical example of a diploma certificate that in French would be called somehow, and in Italian and English in a different way. And as well, they do not, even though they may be called diplomas, they do not represent as a comparison the same title, or the same qualification. So that kind of language barrier must be addressed as at ontology, with an ontology approach. What means ontology approach? Means the need of representing the data not anymore in human language, but in a standardized way, is the way that we are addressing to solve and to face the issue. Sorry for the background noise. Therefore, our work daily is to try to define and to find out which are the areas where these ontologies are missing, and find out how to handle that or to integrate more than ontologies in one. So how this is done is to use not anymore, as I said, the human readable representation, but somehow a structural level representation where you describe every element in a standardized way, and then that way comes to be translated into human readable language. So the title I was talking about, second level of graduation, or let's say higher education qualification, there are a lot of levels, EQTF levels, whatever. So we represent the data only in that way. So that overcomes the issue of the language when you are talking about somehow data representation. Now, the second level out of it is a human readable level. So means when you express this information in different languages, you have a kind of language barrier. Nevertheless, this issue is, apart from, as our first speaker was explaining, when we talk about what is a blockchain, how to express these kind of characteristics, that level of barrier is really limited when you express services not more in text, but in data structures. I don't know if I've been clear, but the problems we have is that the pre-digital era human infrastructure was based on languages. The post-digital era human infrastructure is not anymore supposed to be expressing languages, but expressing digital format, so levels, numbers, whatever is independent from the language. In that way, you really overcome the language barrier from its source, not from its front end, so facade. So that's the way we are dealing with this. This is the most complex way to handle, but the most long-term approach that you may have, because in that way you may really solve the all interoperability issues we have in the 28 member states, but that would be the same outside it. So representing data, expressing information in every transaction in a digital format, and then converting them into a human readable format when they are supposed to be presented to a human, so to a natural person. While for example, for non-natural person, for example, machine to machine, or with corporation to corporation, the idea is to keep the digital format as a representation. So this is our approach, is really a technical approach. There's a lot of issues following this approach because you have to put together several entities, several member states. And for example, in our diploma case, you must have even different stakeholders that are supposed to be setting this level, setting these, let's say, standards. And I believe the problem that we have at the moment is mainly to define the standards that are common for everybody. And that's our job, our daily job somehow. Then we believe that these standards will be somehow transformed, converted to ISO or IEEE or ITU, or I'm also the convener of the Sentinel group on blockchain as JTC 19. So within Europe, we are having a group that standardized the same, and I believe some of your colleagues is part of this group as well. But we try to avoid to go to the level of front-end interface and keeping the issue solved at technical level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have time for a quick question, or should we proceed? Because
maybe for a quick question, yes.
For a quick question, okay. So So you speak about ontology, different ontologies that encounter themselves. So actually we need to reconceive all the process. How is it going to be done in a concrete way? Because I understand the idea behind, but for me, that I have a different background than yours, it's not so evident how you should proceed with this in a realistic way.
Yes.
So in a applicative
yeah,
way.
I understand effective way. So the concept is, first of all, that let's say 3 cases. One, you have already a standard, so that's easy. You follow that standard and you set all the data that by design cannot be different from the standard. Okay, so let's say if you have now very easy, if you have a length and you have feet, meters, or whatever, you set a standard for you is meter and the representation is always in meters. That's it for Europe. Somehow now UK is outside EU, but somehow for Europe is easy, but that won't be easy outside, but there will always be a way to convert them when there is a standard. In many cases, as the length that would be outside use or globally, you have multiple standards. So what we do is we express the same information in all the standards that you are considering global. So in that case, could be meters, feet, or whatever you want to use. But that item would be understandable for each country they use that data. So if I want to say I want to go from Paris to London, okay, I can put this in miles, I can put this in kilometers, I can put it in whatever unit I want. Nevertheless, everybody would understand that. We are following that daily. So the problem, we don't have a standard like that for everything we are talking about. So I would say stupidly, because I see you in video, the color of your hairs. I guess there is a million standards to define a color that is gonna be impossible. So if I had to describe, for example, a passport for a human being, it was gonna be a trouble to translate a color standard from one language to the other, because there's not even gonna be an easy way to represent that. But now I'm making an exaggeration. If I can take a picture and a specific quality of your hairs, and I can define the RGB color for that, that is a standard that can be understandable for everybody. And then I don't need a language to define that, because in French it would be blonde, in English it would be whatever we want to use it. You know, at the end of the story, that RGB color is gonna define my standard. So representing the data in that type will solve, from our point of view, the source of the issue. So the source of the fact that we are representing facts in a way that is not, let's say, digital. So RGB is digital. There are 3 digits or 3 codes that you can use for that. Now is a stupid example, but it's an example that you understand that the issue can be addressed somehow, you know.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Really clear example. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Pedro. Yeah, it's very interesting, this approach of this second layer that you're bringing. To move with the event, I just want to remind you that you can submit your questions to the Slido link that is on the chat. We have already some questions, and we will go through these questions during the Q&A session. So just to remind you, just feel free to drop a question there if you feel something is missing, or you just want to know something more from the participants. So going further with the program, our next speaker is Florian Clemens. He feels at home in Europe. He's connected especially with Italy and Netherlands, but now he's joining us from Singapore. And in general, he has been involved in several complex financial ecosystems, like he defined it, and that includes several experience on financial monetary systemic crisis. But he comes here to speak us about language, and he has a unique approach for building language and he truly believes that this can be done in a universal manner that will be accessible to anyone. So without going further on his claim and his presentation, I give the floor to Floris. Please tell us more about these ideas.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, excellent. I'm going to share a presentation. Can you see it? I'm sharing my screen. Yep,
yes,
great. So we're going to talk today about the interlingual semantic internet of entities. That's basically an interlingual semantic internet. And the interlingual semantic internet, that's the first key message, is a lot closer to us than what we probably think. The second key message is that we really need to make a very strong collective effort to keep such an interlingual semantic internet open and freely accessible to all. Let's see, yeah. Second slide, we make intellectual property for this semantic internet freely available. Everyone can use, everyone can take care of it. This is quite relevant. It means that nobody can, it can't imply ownership. Nobody can own this technology. Everyone can use it. And it's also not possible to charge for this technology. Should people do that, there is universal care. Everyone can take action, and not just the people who claim to have this intellectual property. That's me in our garden in Singapore. But Gustav already introduced me. Probably more important is that we're working on a universal internet in a community-led way. And we call that the Internet of Entities. Basically 3 sub-communities under one community, one language. With one language, we intend to unify language. We talk about that today. Then there is one space-time. What is very relevant is that we built a synchronized virtual space-time where information and value can be exchanged at the same time, possibly also with geostamps and jurisdiction stamps, which can include real-time jurisdictions and applicable law. And we're working with a subcommunity on one value. Now, typically when you take a look at our current value propositions are typically dualistic. We have rights versus obligations, we have claims versus liabilities, we have 2 sides of the balance sheet, we have a double entry bookkeeping, debtors versus creditors, we create money when we create debt, we destroy debt by destroying money, etc., etc. And what we actually see when we move to a tokenized world is that all these dualities actually start to shift and they become non-dualistic. And that is a completely different way to deal with value. And it will have consequences legally, financially, accounting-wise, etc. And on the Internet of Entities, where everything is a semantic state, you get a non-dualistic exchange of value and information. Bringing this all together will lead to a new open internet. So what is the Internet of Entities? So basically the Internet of Entities is an internet with universal interlingual semantic states. So semantic state is what we're really talking about. We have all kinds of semantic states and they can all interact with each other. Now, a semantic state is just a representation of information or value. The great thing is that every semantic state has a universally unique address, and that address actually is self-descriptive. And thank you so much, Pietro, for your introduction. What you actually see in that information address is a structure that comes from a very strong ontology that can provide exactly all contextual parts to describe meaning in a self-descriptive way. And the great thing is that that meaning actually is interlingually defined. So we can translate it from one to another using obviously an open semantic repository. So semantic states are universally and interlingually definable and interpretable. We can govern them because actually what you do when you govern a semantic state, you put another semantic state on top. It's really an easy and elegant way to govern information. And then that's great because you can express anything about another semantic state. So governance features are really very wide as language itself. The information addresses are universally unique, which means that all information states, semantic states, can interact and reach each other. And yeah, they can also interoperate with each other. So for instance, if I define something in Dutch, someone else is changing that information in Vietnamese when he or she has access rights to it. And someone else can see that information, also allowing access rights, to see that in Slovak. So with this ontological model and basically self-descriptive algorithm, it is possible to create such an internet with universal semantic states. Now, the framework of that internet is the internet of entities. So an entity can be anything. It can be a person, organization, a device, an asset, an action, an event, a rule, a condition, doesn't matter, as long as it is identifiable. And we basically group the semantic states around the entities, hence, and also the relations between the entities and the attributes. Hence, we call this the Internet of Entities. Now, that was the first part where we say, hey, it's important to realize that actually it is quite feasible to have an interlingual semantic internet. The second thing is a bit more worryable, that you have to see the semantic internet as actually a merger of language and algorithms, or actually a merger of language and the internet. And what is important is that we have to understand accessibility to that technology. So language is something we believe we can all use openly and freely. Nobody owns language, everybody owns language. Nobody can charge for it, nobody can claim exclusivity or prevent someone else from using language. This is exactly what we thought about the internet in the 1990s. The internet is of everyone and it's of no one. We don't need to pay in order to get onto the internet. Now, with a 2020 mindset and vision, actually we see that the internet is no longer free to use. When we access the internet, we have to give up our information position, our data sovereignty, and our privacy. So the internet is no longer a means of communication that is of all of us and to all of our benefit. It is not. What we now also see with language, when algorithms actually start to come into language, voice recognition, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, the language we search in, those parts of language are also no longer free. Most of those technologies are proprietary in nature. So if we combine algorithms and we extrapolate this trend, will we have an internet, a semantic internet that is open and free, or exclusive and not free? And really we have to have a call of action right now collectively to ensure that it will be open and free for all of us. Because with the semantic internet, language will become more powerful than existing language. And if our access is not open and free, we have a real big issue. Now, it's easy to think, oh, it's the fault of Google, Alexa, Siri, and Facebook, but that's not the way it is. The real issue is that solutions have been created in institutional frameworks. And these institutional frameworks have typical political currencies of interest. So when people create intellectual property, you register this in an institutional name. There is no such thing as common property that is of everyone. And this is a big issue. We need to have a communal framework where we can register something that everyone can use and everyone can take care of, and nobody can claim exclusivity. This is what we try to achieve. So it is registered in the name of an open community. But then it's also important to have open community governance with it. So this is what we try to do, to actually create a very open community where systemic innovation, and not just individual application innovation, but systemic innovation that we use all of us together, can be free from political currencies of biased interest. So when we started working on a semantic internet in 2014, we said, okay, it needs to be open, right? So then it's logical. Also, the development process needs to be open. And we started up very open, and I would say quite naively, because in the 3 years that followed, there were continuous institutional underminings in all kinds of forms and shape that could not help actually to generate that openness of the interlingual semantic internet. So we decided in 2017, let's stop this. We close the development for institutions. We go under the radar with persons that don't have an institutional agenda. And what we saw was a tremendous uplift in development speed. People started building for purpose rather than for institutional agendas. And that really made a big difference. So a few years further down the line, and we were close, we think, to opening up, but we only want to do that when we have sufficient critical mass, momentum, and network effects, so that when we come out, it's something that people say, okay, this is authoritative and good enough, and we can build onto this as an open standard. So the idea is to release in 2021, 2022, an ontological model that explains the structuring and the self-description of meaning in an interlingual way, standards, protocols, and algorithms in order to create those semantic states interlingually, but also an interlingual semantic repository where we intend to have about 1 million translated concepts. That's 12,500 semantic concepts in about 80 languages. It looks more like a Wikipedia kind of approach than, but with very serious standards to confirm to quality. In order to do this well, you need to have a very good open governance model, and I'm not going to talk about how we set standards, which is a bit different than most standardization organizations today. I'm also not going to talk too much about interlingual semantic concept repository, how we manage that. That's 2 presentations by itself. But what I want to share is something that we really find is a cool feature. If we want to have an open community governance, then language is actually one of the first problems. So with semantic states, we can actually create language sentences. And everyone can actually propose an agenda topic with around 5 interlingual semantic concepts. So everyone can propose in the agenda in their own language. We think that is very important. What we then do, we vote on the topics, and the 40 most important topics basically come out. And then we have a kind of forced ranking. So that we have a community agenda setting in which everyone can participate in their own language. Now, final slide. When we take a look at institutional development of standards and solutions and an open, commonly managed interlingual semantic standards, protocols, repositories, we can actually help each other. One thing has to be completely open. And that can be institutionally supported, endorsed, and others can really focus on their value added, which is the creation of normative standards, very applicable industrial or national standards, and we could help each other out here. W3C, it would be great if for new browser support, semantic internet could be supported in some HTML7, whatever. The EU obviously has a lot of interlingual translations to do. It would be great if they could use an open repository that is community managed, including other languages. And another one that we really think is interesting is central banks. Right now there's digital currencies coming. Now you tell me, do you want to have a digital currency that can go into a smart contract only supporting 1 or 2 languages, or a currency that is actually possible to interoperate in smart contracts in around 80 languages? And here, actually, something very interesting could happen, because central banks on their digital currencies will need to make a decision probably in the next 2 years on the semantic support of their digital currencies. And rather than competing on semantic support, they could actually say, well, let's establish a common open standard together. And that could actually facilitate relatively soon something like this. Anyway, if we can work together, institutions with an open community, to ensure that our semantical technologies and semantic internet remain open and accessible, please feel free to reach out, and I'll show you my email address here at the bottom, and then that is about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Floris, for your presentation and for giving us this vision of this universal construction of language. Just a quick question on this. In general, how to handle the relation usually between the size of the community that is developing standards and efficiency? Usually is faster to build standards in a closed community, and obviously to get more inclusion also involves this, to process actually these decisions in a fast manner, because if it takes too long to get these arrangements. So how have you think about this efficiency relation when you have a mechanism that will allow, actually, if I understood you correctly, to have a universal construction of blockchain languages?
Yeah. So basically, when it comes to the structure, building the ontology, building the methodology, I think we benefited from not having too much institutional parties bothering us. First of all, because of IP process issues, but secondly, we could really speed up with purpose. Now we're broadening up again when we are making the semantic repository. And what is relevant here is that we basically approach this from two sides. We have a metrics organization on the one side, metrics community, I have to say, where we basically have languages on one axis and domain-specific expertise on the other. We work with so-called term lists. So the term lists are made by several specialists from, for instance, chemistry or biology or medical or economical or legal expertise, where people build the term list from different languages on one specific field. So that's a kind of metrics organization that you don't have like 40% of the people are specialized in Spanish and you only have one person in Bengali. That is not the way we should structure. So the metrics organization ensures that we have some kind of structured distribution of capabilities. On the other side, we have the open community that can do suggestions, come up with new terms, make proposals, but also vote on the way things are being defined. So rather than just having a translation, a contextually hyperstructured translation that probably still may have a bit of ambiguity, we have something called a confidence rating. So the community can participate and say, hey, this is actually a very good translation. If you use this translation, there may still be some risk. So by having that structure of language and specialism on the other side, we feel we can reach out relatively fast to a large community, to make the semantic repository.
Okay. Thank you, Floris. We have to move also for reasons of time, but thanks a lot for your presentation and this question. I just give the floor to Mariana to introduce us to the next speaker.
Yeah, next speaker is Santosh Misra. Hope that I pronounced in the correct way. E-Governance Commissioner of the Tamil Nadu region. We had a conversation with him yesterday. Really nice to have a representative of an Indian country, so a country that is more trained with respect to the other on bilingual stuff. So actually the fact that English is frequently used in for official documents, but anyway, the other languages of every region are not official languages of the country, but has a kind of official status that are used for the documentation. So I would like to ask him how this culture is actually translated into blockchain application and into standards with respect to blockchain. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mariana, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Inatba. It's always exciting to participate in these deliberations, and actually today's was, I must say, a very stimulating session. I think I learned a lot by listening to my previous speakers. So, I mean, language, and let me refer to what Kristen was presenting, a transaction model of language. So language is essentially a means of communicating a specific context which is in your mind to someone who's sitting next to you and you're conversing with him or her, and trying to convey those feelings in as close contextual sense as you can. So that definition itself sort of gives rise to ambiguity. I think even when we are talking face to face with friends and families, I think we say something and that gets interpreted in a very different manner, because the thought process or the context behind what you said and the thought process and the context in which the receiver accepts it are very different. And I think it doesn't matter if the clarity doesn't arise even in one language. And when you have multiplicity of language, this problem becomes exponentially complex. So if you look at India, for example, I mean, in the last census, we had 19,500 mother tongues, distinct mother tongues identified, which is like mind-boggling. So of course, this includes dialects. So out of those 19,500, there are 121 very distinct languages. If you look at Indian Constitution, the Constitution itself recognizes 22 official languages which exist in the Schedule 8 of Constitution. So we are like, I think, a very, very diverse society. And the thing is that, and last 70 odd years, or last even, I think I would say even 100 odd years, this problem got somehow, I think we have been able to resolve it to a great extent. While the states are predominantly linguistic. So for Tamil Nadu is a Tamil state. The language is, of course, Tamil. If you go to Gujarat, the language is Gujarati. If you go to Punjab, it's Punjabi. If you go to Bengal, it's Bengali. So each state has its own official language. And what happens is we have very successfully sort of adopted this bilingual system of working where English is the common thread. And then on top of that, you have the regional language right on it. So all the key documents, all the key transactions. So if you go to a bank, if you go to a passport office, if you get your driving license, all of those are either, if you go to India has the largest digital identity program anywhere in the world. So it's 1.3 billion people have got their unique digital identities along with their biometrics captured and stored, and they are used in daily transactions, particularly on the KYC and those kind of transactions in financial institutions and many other places. So if you look at your digital identity program, for example, so it has every name and every individual is captured in two ways. So you have English as well as the regional language of your choice. So you can use Hindi, you can use Tamil, you can use Malayalam, and whatever you have. And I think the same thing. So for example, what we are building in terms of blockchain in Tamil Nadu, it's similar. And I was very happy to connect to listen to Pietro Marchioni, if I've pronounced his name right. who's part of EBSI. And similar to EBSI, we have plans of creating, and we have sort of started experimenting with it, built some proof of concepts, a blockchain common infrastructure for Tamil Nadu state, which will actually allow different departments to transact onto that, share data, exchange data, register transactions, and also allow private players and outsiders to actually come and play on these common infrastructure and generate value if they like. We'll invite private developers to build DApps on this infrastructure. So when we are developing this system and the way we are trying to handle this, this design is basically have the data. So of course, for example, I mean, Petro was talking about education diplomas and how they are interpreted in a very different manner from one European state to another European state. So when we talk about education diplomas or certificates which are going to be part of this on this blockchain from, say, for example, education department or higher education department, they will take, so we have divided on what should be on-chain data and what should be off-chain data. The on-chain data will be bilingual. That is the current thinking, and it may change. The on-chain data will be bilingual, which will capture all the essentials, which is essentially which things like names and name, gender, date of birth, and the degree or discipline, some basics, and the institution on-chain. And you will have this captured in English as well as in Tamil, for example. And if you were to extend this into another state, say Odisha, you would have it in English and you would have it in Odia, for example. And the rest of the certificate goes as an off-chain document, and then you do the regular stuff. And then anytime you want to verify any of those transactions, you want to access any of those certificates, you want to do any verifications, you can use a combination of on-chain and off-chain data and do the certification or the verification. So this is how we are thinking. Another thing which I have been, because we also, for example, Indian Parliament, I mean, you have parliamentarians coming from all states, right? And you have the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court and the high courts in every state. So the parliamentarians, I mean, they are free to speak in any of the scheduled languages, which I just mentioned, about 22 of them. So there's this organization in India called Center for Development of Advanced Computing. And one of the things they are doing is live translation of documents, and whatever gets transacted in Parliament is highly technical and legal document. So how do you reliably translate those into a different language? And they have built a very successful model, and I think it is being used in a couple of languages. I think they are expanding it to cover all 22 languages, and they have been very successful at it. Also, this NLP advances, which have been happening in the recent years, live translations, has actually made this barrier reduced in its height. I think it's made things much more accessible. Going forward, I think I see that this sort of becomes it becomes less of a problem with more and more sophisticated NLP AI systems being built and put to use. So I think this is overall where how we are handling it in Indian context. And I mean, a lot of these documents or certificates are applicable nationally, and they are issued in one place, and then you can use that, as I said, things like driver's license or Aadhaar identity, which is the digital identity for you. Or recently, there are 2 more programs which are coming up, which is one is National Digital Health Mission, which is essentially a repository of electronic health records nationally. And imagine, I mean, that's going to be a massive effort. Again, you would probably go with an approach which is bilingual. Another thing I just want to quickly mention is that I have visited some of these countries like Korea, and what I saw is that in Korea, for example, if you talk about economics, even the technical terms, terms which have a very specific meaning even within the English language, have been actually translated into Korean. Same thing with science or engineering, I think. Whereas in India, I guess a traditional practice has been that the key technical terms have been left in English itself. So that kind of becomes a thread of common communication when transacting amongst people coming from a different linguistic background. So that kind of eases this problem, which might be in a highly exacerbated state in other countries or other nationalities. So this because this has been, India has been, as I said, very, very pluralistic and a very diverse country. We have been kind of figured a way around I wouldn't say it's solved, but I think we have figured a way around making it very practical and doable on field. So that's my take on this. So thank you for having me here.
Thanks, Santosh. I don't know if Mariana, do you have one question for Santosh? I probably will want just to jump in because I just remember also this notion that we were speaking before about the de facto.
I had the same question. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, please. I don't know if you can tell us this.
Yesterday we argue on the de facto standards implementation, so not enforcing through an official standard imposition the usage or of a certain language standard with respect to another one, but just propose to the public environment, because of course it's different between public institution and the private environment, and see how it goes. And since actually we have a first implementation that is current and probably is not the best efficient that exists nowadays, but of course it will be adopted and from the public institutions, and then they will probably question about if it's really efficient or not, but that's the fact that it's quite different with respect to the blockchain tech environment nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a small thread for the viewers. I think this was a thread we were having yesterday, where we were talking about setting standards and then running developments after that, or having development done and then looking at standards. So I think what I was trying to propose was that these two are kind of a parallel activity. So as you don't necessarily wait for the standards to completely stabilize and get frozen or get solid and concrete, and then you start development, because that's never going to happen. I mean, that's not how the anything organic or anything in nature works. I think it works simultaneously. So in fact, you start building something, and if it is a good enough solution, and if it follows and it solves an existing problem, it becomes a standard. I think the key is that whether it solves the problem or not. And if you, and while you at the same time, I mean, you have to have the other larger picture in mind, that you need to have standards so that not everybody starts building their own little versions of things which don't talk to each other. So you also simultaneously work on standards. So for example, if I talk about Tamil Nadu state, we actually, while we are designing our system, which will be in the approach and concept very similar to EBSI, we have also released our blockchain policy. And so, I mean, these two works were being done in parallel, and not necessarily they were sequential. And I think this is what will happen in blockchain space as well. And I think, and for that matter, in any emerging technology, so that you have an iterative process. So you build something and you come up with a standard, and you then find, oh, this thing doesn't really is so good because it fails here and here and here. And then you say that, okay, if it fails here, can we upgrade our standards to make sure that we build another version which doesn't fail? And I think that's the kind of interaction which happens. And I was referring yesterday in the discussion also that it's good that some of the people who are leading the development are also part of the standard setting community, so that, I mean, you straddle both the worlds and you sort of enrich your developmental experience into standard setting and standard setting experience into developmental strategies.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So we are approaching also our time from here, but so we'll go to our last speaker. I think she joined us just a little bit later because she was connected now. I think Nena Dokusov, I don't know if she's already here.
I'm here.
Oh, yes, great.
Yeah, I'm here, but my screen is rounded, so I will stop the video and share the screen if I can do this.
I will just give, please go ahead, and while you're doing this, I will just give a brief introduction. So Nina Dokusova has a very vast experience in general topics of commerce, economy, and global governance, but especially she has worked with the UN CFACT, so she has a lot of experience actually on how to overcome languages barriers in the governance of blockchains. But she also is the head of the blockchain group of the Ministry of Economy of Slovenia. So I think that also she has an interesting background on how to transport these different blockchain standards into different languages at both levels, at the national levels in Slovenia, but also at the European and on the United Nations governance infrastructures. So please go ahead, Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pietro. I'm very sorry I joined very late today because we had some important meeting with the minister, and I'm happy that I managed to join you at the last part. It was interesting to listen to the debate. Thank you for the presentation. I would like just maybe to touch first the certain issues that we are facing here with the standards. It was all mentioned. EPSI was mentioned. We have UN CFACT chain concept within UN, but in any case, we are trying to find out which are the most important things that can be like a common denominator for all that blockchains and for all the protocols that are analyzed, that are implemented, and from which we demand that they understand each other's. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, now we see your screen.
Presentation?
Yep, the presentation.
Okay, perfect. So maybe I can start from that the general challenges of blockchain. First, when we started, it was a quite strange word, blockchain. So as a word, that was really a challenge, really an issue, how to start to communicate what is blockchain at all. Because for the people on the government level, for the people on the society level that are not very technical, and developers and programmers, it was very unclear how to explain what is blockchain. This was the first thing. The second thing was the rationality of translation, how it can be translated into national languages to be understandable. For example, in Slovenia, we have a term, this is a chain, a technology for chaining of the blocks. We don't have, because if we don't want to use blockchain as a word, then we have to translate in Slovenian, and it comes to four words that can be or that are connected together. So we stopped to trying to find a appropriate term. So now we are using blockchain in every communication. This is first. The second, maybe what I want to touch are the challenges of blockchain itself. You mentioned that we are cooperating also. I'm head of delegation of Slovenia at UNCE and UN CFACT, and UN CFACT also developed a white paper on blockchain and is very much touching the standards and semantics. I think it's very important paper which can be base for everything, and to simplify the definition how we can approach to standards. So maybe just to enlighten that type or that vision, they are analyzing the understanding and accessing the data. The definition is of semantic webs. Then there is a need for appropriate semantic networks. It is the finding from that white paper, but is very important also for our interoperable infrastructures that we are trying to set, and I will come back later with more detailed description. All this with semantics gives us the opportunities for standardization and for standardization organizations and technology providers to provide or deliver technical specifications which will release new value by supporting interoperability. So when we analyze how interoperability can be more smoothly implemented, then we definitely come to the need of standards, but the need of standards is provoked by the need of semantic unification of the meanings. So if we have complex issues and don't have standards that would provide the same meaning of the data that we have on disposal, then also the protocols cannot understand between themselves, and also we cannot have multi-chain cross-border solutions within provided within that infrastructures. So what are the relevant topics for global interoperable blockchain infrastructures? As I said, data requirements need to be well defined to ensure mutual comprehension. We heard also last time Pietro, I'm sure that he mentioned this in the beginning of this presentation and conference, that even in English language, some thing is not has not the same meaning. We can use more words for the same meaning of one issue. So the mutual comprehension of the data that we have on disposal is very important. The second thing is that clear semantic in metadata is very important. It can enable access to data in different ledgers by identifying links to data and transform it into appropriate access. If I go on, standard basic semantic models could facilitate that network of data exchange. The integration across platforms, I'm here staying within the integration across platforms and not the integration across different protocols, because we would go too in depth if we start to analyze specific layers that can be provided for integration of the protocols. And then also including diverse blockchain applications the applications can be of a main challenge here, because we have different types of data in different types of applications. And if we don't have an opportunity to standardize, for standardization, for semantic standardization, then I'm sure that that cross-border interoperability will lack of efficiency and lack of possibility to be also widened. So unified definition of data to decrease the complexity of the system. If I go on, a limitation for language and cultural barriers, what is the title of today's conference? We started to develop a project, UNC Fact Chain. This is the project that will be white paper at the beginning, but it will be developed furtherly into test cross-border interoperable network or infrastructure on blockchain. And what is important here that we are analyzing three sorts of interoperability. I will explain this a little bit later. Legal governance and technical interoperability, and how we can come closer to that cultural and language barriers. We know that legal issues, that legislation is very relevant for expressing that that characteristics of language and cultural issues on the national level. So different national concepts of how to organize certain issues can be reflected also in language and cultural differences, but on the other hand, in the legislation that is specific for each country. So we can connect these language and cultural barriers or issues also with the legislation that is specific for each country. And we started to research how legal issues can define interoperability during, not during, but through certain cases that can be very relevant to communicate internationally. So the findings were that many governments have established multinational and international frameworks that seek to harmonize legislation and practices in order to achieve that legal interoperability. So if we achieve legal interoperability, we think that also the language and cultural barriers decrease substantially, because if we unify and standardize certain issues and the terms, then we can express with a small amount of risk that the interoperability can be assured through that frameworks. So usually the applicable local legal frameworks provide stipulations that deal with cross-border matters, and also provide guidance in case that legal frameworks conflict with each other. We also found out that we can have a local legal frameworks that can be in conflict with each other. So the focus of legal interoperability research was here to analyze applicable laws, temper evidence and resistance, governance, privacy issues, digital signatures, smart contracts, and also multi-chain transaction within legal interoperability on the application and API level. It was quite demanding, the preparation of our white paper, but we found out that really semantic standardization and semantic interoperability can be very helpful to provide a total or whole interoperability of blockchain infrastructure. What we are doing on the European level with EBSI and with European Blockchain Partnership is also trying to find the standardized form and the standardization of EBSI. We just started with the technical governance working group, which task is also to find the standardization for certain issues of interoperability, and also for the use cases that we are developing in this stage. We are developing second phase now of self-sovereign identity, we are developing diplomas on blockchain, trusted sharing data. This is VAT traceability on blockchain, and also notarization. And for these use cases, I hope we will have in a short time very unified and comprehensive terminology, so that we can define quite good standards also with the collection from different international organizations. And if I just come back to that national or specific contribution of the national networks, I have to say that last year we launched first national blockchain infrastructure for services. It was called C-Chain, and it is based on HashNet protocol. It has to be started on the national level, and I don't think that cultural and language barriers stopped us from going wider, but it has to be tested, and it has to be regionally dispersed and regionally scaled up, also with the purpose to test the services on this, applications on this, and to create the applications that would fit for a specific type of services. So we have had to start at the local level without local specifics. Then it grew into national interoperable cross-border infrastructure. It had strong, and it still has strong potential to scale up regionally. And it's really not very much dependent on language and cultural barriers. We found out that the most important issue is to strengthen access to regional markets. We have to know that also in other parts of Europe, in Spain, like Alastria, like in Latin America, LA Chain, others are developed on the national levels, and they then grow on a regional level and internationally. In any case, we will need to find the proper, appropriate, or common standardization approach to enable that protocols communicate together, because we know that China is onboarding different protocols within its BSN network. And if we want to be competitive, then we need to find an appropriate solutions to standardize and to enable quick data transactions without having an issue of language and cultural barriers. I went through very fast because I didn't know if you left time for questions and answers. I would thank you at the moment stop with my presentation. And if you have any questions, just please.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit out of time for an extensive Q&A session. Actually, I will just pose one of the questions to the speakers, to anyone that wants to answer. So we have this question from the Slido channel that says, some who came up with the current definitions, some of them are too short, missing some context to anyone that doesn't understand how the system works. For example, tokens are not assets and do not exist. So in general, I think this question can be framed as like, if there is already some definition, how these discrepancies can be challenged or should not be challenged. What happens when someone actually does not agree with standards or some lexicological standard that has been defined? I don't know if anyone wants to take on this question. Anyone from our speakers feel like reflecting on what to do when yeah, Floris, please.
I could answer a bit to that. I think the issue here is context. And if you define something, context. So what we do when we define a semantic concept, you have to put in sufficient context to understand what it is that you are working about. So when we come up with a semantic concept in the semantic repository, we basically go through first a number of questions and structures that we have to go through because of the ontology that we have to define first. And already by going through that, we realize that we're narrowing down in precision of what this really means. Then it still can be that you need to make an additional description. So we apply additional descriptions definitely interlingually. For instance, the concept of camel as an animal, in English, a camel can have 1 and 2 humps. But in German, a camel with 1 hump is called dromedar, and with 2 is camel. So we see a difference here. The other way around as well, they're both Germanic languages. We see that the Affe is both an ape and a monkey, one with tail and one without a tail. But in German, you have only one word for that. So you have to specify like with a tail or without a tail in order to explain in German what it could be in English, or the other way around with a camel. So that is one way to solve it. The other way is to really make sure that you get the context really right. And you have to define that quite specifically. So when you want to work on a semantic internet, it is not so much, it's probably like this. No, then you really go wrong. You really have to hyperstructure it. This is how we call it. But then once it is hyperstructured, it means that all use cases, all contexts, in all languages can basically interpret and work with it. And that is then community decided.
Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupt you, but I think that we are running short of time. So thanks a lot for your quick take on this question. And now I will leave the floor to Ismael Arribas. I think he's with us. So Ismael, please, as the chair of the interoperability group, we really want to know what could be your closing remarks after this session. Please, Ismael.
Thanks, Gustavo. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, Singapore, Flores over there. Well, really appreciate the richness of your open mind, giving your point of view. If I could remark, Jeff said not reaching consensus is easy with ambiguous terms, and clarity is extremely important in translation. Sometimes not to define one specific term is the decision on standards. Kristen mentioned we need to be able to communicate about DLT governance. Very clear message, different dimensions over that. Pietro entered in the head of our technology in terms of the head of ontology. You may me to make this final joke about this aspects of how we express languages in on off-chain and on-chain are really different, and sometimes the standards is on-chain, but is not matching with the off-chain. Flores went through a universal information and communication and value. That's message for an interlingual semantic internet. There were one word that highlight myself about queryable, a part of the universally defined and interpretable terms. Santos bet because of this multilingual coexistence over de facto standards as a click with the creativity instead of imposing regulatory implementations going for the URI standards. Nena enter into protocols and blockchain are demanding to understand each other, and we need a neutral comprehension. That could be kind of my conclusions, remarks of this interesting session. If I could to spread these 5 last minutes of the day of the event, where do you think that in ADVA is useful for these challenges? Quick floor is yours again before Mariana and Gustavo could say bye-bye to all of us.
Okay, great question from from Isabel, and let's go on the same order of the speaker. Maybe we start with Jeff.
So I think really, establishing standards and making sure that the various nations who are represented by INATBA are also participating in international standards efforts will be, I think, a critical part of making sure that these kinds of interoperable infrastructures are actually effective.
Thank you so much for your take. Kirsten, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So in my opinion, we really just need to be liaising with each other more. I know that hosting events like this is highly effective to share what we're working on, but it's not akin to collaborating on a month-to-month basis. So I think as long as we can do that, we're in a good place. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Pietro?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have problems with the line. Give me a second. Can you go on with the next speaker?
Yeah, Floris, we will go back to Pietro so he picks his
yeah, I think INATBA could help pretty much to a comment that Ad Croft also mentioned in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to declare the semantic internet to be a commons-based, well, infrastructure at least, a commons-based solution. I think if INATBA, for its own terminology, is using open communal semantic repositories, that is an important step forward to show that we need to have this openness, and not that we all try to define our own semantic solutions, because then we're not going to get there.
Thank you so much. Santosh?
Yeah, I think I completely endorse what Kristen was saying, and I think bringing us together, and because all of us are in some form or the other struggling with similar problems, and I think INATBA can actually provide this platform where we can actually learn from each other and try to, save the trouble of reinventing the wheel. So, if somebody has already solved a problem and actually has figured out a solution which can work, I think it's much more convenient to adopt that than go reinventing itself. So I think that's where you can play a significant role, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. Maybe now we can go with Pietro.
Yes,
Pietro,
no
please.
problem. At the end, I believe that as the way INATBA is built, I believe that from our point of view, the best effort can be spent by INATBA is to have its own participants to be agreeing with some kind of the standards or the approaches we are proposing, and then the market drives the standardization normally. So whenever we have a solution that could be applied by, I don't say everybody, by most of the participants, applying it would make it standard, even more than defining it as a standard.
Thank you, Pedro. And Nena?
I had to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think INATBA can play quite important role here. We have a lot of standardization organizations. If INATBA manages to connect all this knowledge that that standardization organizations have, and to create some common framework. Okay, you bring us together. You bring governments through government advisory body. You bring businesses, but in any case, you can maybe be a kind of intermediary between the findings in the technical and professional level, and also between standardization organizations. And this is also how I thought at the first time that INATBA would play a role here, like some kind of intermediary, but a central point of collecting and creating the framework to be then implement it and maybe to enforce that implementation in the practice. This would be mine.
Well, ladies and
We may
gentlemen,
have some,
yeah,
I hope
thank
we
you,
have some
thank you.
ideas.
No.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you so much. I think is the best way to close the ceremony of today to understand each other.
Thank you so much. I just want to also thanks again Avkrov and Martina Piazza for everything that they have done also for this workshop, and I think for this roundtable, and I think I have learned a lot. I don't know, I will just leave the last word to Mariana, and thank you everyone. Mariana, please.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the participation. Nice discussion. I really appreciated it. So something that actually for me is quite. So I'm not from this background, and I am always happy to learn something new about taxonomy, standard languages, and also for technical people, it's really interesting because, as Pietro said, there is sort of some problem that can be solved use technology, so different metrics to respect to another one. So it's always interesting, and I'm really happy to participate and to help organizing this type of event. So looking forward to see you in future events that we are going to organize with the governance working group, together with the interoperability working group, and hopefully with others working groups. We do not know. And thanks to INATPA for helping us organizing it.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Bye everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.